Of course, to get a proper look at the issue, we had to get into rural Senegal. In this case, a village close enough to see the power lines and where the zealots cherished solar, which shuts off when the sun goes down, though our car could barely make it up the sand road to a place whose location few people seem to know.
Wow.
jënd gaz defar yépp toog pour di toog saxar si
He's
dafa
like
metti
this.
saxaane bi yenu matt di ñëw
Yeah.
ba ineet
Wow. Ban
am diggam ak midi waaw ñetti waxtu lay doon diggam ak suba boo nga heure bi ngay taaree heure bi ngay taar añ ba taaree bu am ñu dara la ñu
nee na moom dem nga école. She never went to school.
Can she read and write?
Nee na est-ce que mën nga lire ak
dara
waaw.
man ma ne bu ñu màggee jàmm ba jàng ba am ba ñu am liggéey ñu dem tukki
tukki fan maman.
tukki xanaa kay liggéey ñëw indi fii ndax ñun sonn nañu
mais nee na doo leen nam.
ma ne leen dinaa leen namm moom waaye na xoolal li fii rek
naa 5 déedéet ay gone lan ñu nga ne la sinon sànq bi ma leen di may ñu jëndi caaf bi may dund moom bëgguma ñu dund bi may dund ma moom bëgguma samay doom dund moo taxit maa ngi leen jéem ñu dugg ci école pour jàng man xam naa ñun sonn nañ ba pare kon suñu doom yi nañ fexe ñoom ñu jàngi pour bañ dinu dal ñun dal lee en tout cas xam nga ñoom mën nanoo màgg ma bëgg leen bii ñu bëgg dee waaw loolu moo ma ci jaaxal mais ma sañoon moom wax dëgg yàlla ñu dugg ci métier moo xamante ni dañuy tekki dara nekk ci loo xam dañuy tekki dara waaw mën naa ni moo noon seew ñu doon directeur di jàngale ji ñu màgg bëgg leneen ma sañoon ni mën nañ doon mécanicien wala ñu mën a tukki di jéem a réaliser dara di li ci kër gi yëpp man ngaa jëm fii ñoom ñu jëm te ay nag man lu ma doon seew daal li may dund man ñoom duñ ko dund si am beneen dund ku dund bi ma ñëw waaw ci fi ma toll nii.
Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of our program series on the climate discussion Nexus documentary In the Dark about energy poverty with specific reference to Senegal and West Africa. And today, I'm joined in the studio by Magatte Wade, entrepreneur, activist, gadfly, and daughter of Senegal, and remotely by energy expert Heather Exner-Pirot of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, also an advisor to the Business Council of Canada and the Indigenous Resource Network, to discuss why energy isn't just important to development in Africa and elsewhere, it's essentially synonymous with it. As those clips from the documentary that you just saw illustrate, life without energy isn't romantic, it's unrelentingly harsh. And so, Heather, thanks for being with us. And I want to start by asking, how did you get involved in this particular field?
Yeah, well, great question. So I grew up in Saskatchewan and was working in Saskatchewan. I did my PhD research on Arctic and Northern development. That was always Indigenous development. And usually the economic development opportunities were resource-based, either in energy or natural resources. But that was usually also the constraint for development, for people going to school, for people getting to jobs, having to deal with a lot of kind of the structural poverty that communities and Indigenous communities do. So that's how I got interested in it. I also have to say, back when I was going to university, international development was quite a big issue. I did some work in Geneva, some environmental NGOs there. And then for me, it was really striking how in the last 10, 15 years, that issue kind of fell off the radar, that international policy priorities became overwhelmingly about climate, and poverty really fell off kind of the cliff on what was important to people.
And I think one of the reasons why is that most of the people who go around talking about this and consulting with one another live in places where you don't wonder if the plug is going to work. That the experience, what I call homo conferensis, right? Those of us who get in jet airplanes and exchange cliches from one continent to another, we worry about which plug adapter to take with us. But again, Magatte, when you grew up, plug adapters just like they weren't a big issue, right?
No, they were not.
Yeah, there's just no power at all. And it's so hard for many people who are concerned with the issue to understand the lives of the kind of people we saw in those clips. I don't know how long your family's been in Saskatchewan. I know somebody's a rancher there whose grandparents arrived. He was a preacher, came by raft up the river, and again lived in sod houses. So it's not that we're so far from it chronologically in this Western world, but we're so far from it as a life experience.
Yeah, I'll say, my dad grew up in the 40s in Saskatchewan. They didn't have running water. They didn't have, an automobile until he was, a little bit older. And so I'm only one generation from that real experience with energy poverty. And a lot of Indigenous people are, that's the current generation that they have to deal with. So for me, I often think, that it is being that one generation or two generation urbanized where we've been able to take that electricity reliability for granted, probably maybe since the 80s, and even more so every year getting more reliable. And I think it's that mentality that has, moved us up the hierarchy of needs, I'd say, to think about long term problems like climate change. But for most people, they're still on that bottom rung of that hierarchy, and they're to think about the material necessities and their physical security every single day.
Yeah, and you when you were, I think you were around 2, your parents went to Germany and left you with your grandmother, and then you were in Senegal until you were 7, maybe? And so what your grandmother's day was spent in basically kind of grinding, backbreaking manual labor just to take care of stuff we'd now pop in a microwave.
That's right. That's right. So I think you saw it in the you will see it in the documentary, this woman talking about taking 3 hours to just basically be able to collect some wood. And then you have to get that wood going. Anybody who had to do a barbecue without even using those chimneys, to accelerate things, you know what I'm talking about. It takes time for wood to catch on and become hot enough to cook the food. And I'm not even talking about the water needing to be fetched because you're in homes that don't have running water. Why? Because even if they have access to a well, the pump that's needed for the water to have pressure and arrive all the way to where you are. We're talking about energy again, and it's not there. So no, it's people get to live some of the most unproductive lives, and it's a pity. It's a pity not only for them, but it's a pity for the rest of humanity. Because if these people were not spending all of their waking hours fetching wood and or other biomasses to basically be able to cook their food, as well as the water that they need, they would be spending that time joining in with the rest of humanity, trying to solve, issues like cancer and other stuff like that, right? So we're all missing out on this, starting with the person who is very much living in energy poverty.
Yeah, and even the woman who's spending her 3-4 hours a day cooking and has never learned to read, and you're thinking, well, why doesn't she learn to read? Answer is she's busy cooking and gathering firewood. And then, of course, you talk about working on Aboriginal issues, and one of the scandals of Canada is the boil water advisories on reserve. But to boil water, what do you need? You've got to have some kind of fuel, right? Even there, you're just absolutely dependent on energy, or nothing happens.
Well, and this is where policy comes into it. Some most remote communities are dependent on diesel generation. Diesel has the advantage that you can store it, you can transport it, it produces electricity, and it produces heat. And you can use it for transportation fuels. And then some other communities may be connected to electricity, but not to natural gas. And there's a whole range of consequences that come from either being dependent on diesel or on electricity only, or on firewood, still in many cases, supplemented with firewood when utility bills are high. And again, it restricts very much, not only, the comfort and material well-being, but the ability to go to school or take part in other activities because so much of your income is going towards your utility bill. So to this point was made about West Africa, that exists in Canada too. The human cost of being poor and having to direct your time and your effort into just being materially, satisfying your basic needs and not being able to do these other more productive things.
Yeah, and I think it's just so important when people talk about, oh, we must renounce methane for the sake of preventing the temperature from getting 0.1 degrees Celsius warmer, if it might do that. I mean, not my methane, but their methane over there. That we need to understand what the consequences are for the people that we're talking about. So that's the bad news. So if that's what it's like to live without energy, how might Senegal, the rest of Africa, and other places where the lights don't work, or the hospitals, get to where they do. Heather, what does a sensible energy policy look like to you?
So again, I would say for the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a major prioritization of climate policy. And there's good reasons for that. But some of the policy has directed that a lot of World Bank financing, IMF financing, whatever kind of financial help to major projects to industrialization in developing nations is constrained to, for example, renewable or very low carbon electricity systems. That basically means that there's available financing to go towards solar or maybe wind, but not any really to go towards coal or natural gas. And of course, in the developed world, 80% of our energy use is fossil fuels. And that's been the pillar by which to industrialize and to move kind of from a developing to a middle class status. And so taking that option away, I think has caused some harm. Has removed options from, again, the people who are the most vulnerable and need the most options, the most help to do what it is that they need to do to improve the quality of their own lives.
And this is one of the things that I think is so galling. I mean, when you look at poverty in Senegal, you realize that these are people whose lives are a long way from the way we live in the West. So why are they the ones that have to sacrifice?
They're the ones who have to sacrifice because they're the ones who have no say. And they have no say because they're poor. That's it. And when the snake that keeps on eating its own, what do you call it? Its own tail, is they're poor because they don't have they are energy poor. So it's very simple. The West somehow at some point, galvanized by the climate alarmism, has decided net zero is the solution. They are saying they're not exactly doing it, on their own in their own countries. They are putting some policies in place that are very harmful, but it's not catching up as quickly as it could. So they're still not seeing the repercussions of their stupid policies. But what happens at the same time is they said, okay, everybody needs to go to net zero. So they tell the Africans you go to net zero. They would love to tell the Russians you go to net zero, and to the Indians you go to net zero, and to the Chinese you go to net zero. Those guys are hearing the same things that we're hearing as Africans. But do they have to put up with it? Do they have to obey that? No, because they don't have to. And so while China, India, and others are doing whatever it takes to industrialize, get to prosperity, and beat any issues that way, we are the only ones who have to listen to the masters.
And one of the things here, it gets a little bit into the math, but we in the West have not succeeded in electrifying our economies. As you say, 80% of it is still coming from hydrocarbons. And if we could generate all that power with wind and solar and geothermal or whatever the next magic thing is, we still couldn't build a transmission grid. That would be an astronomically expensive engineering project. So how are people in Africa meant to build the kind of things that we can't?
Well, I mean, with magic, I guess I'll say, because again, they are financing short. They don't have the balance sheets. They may be risky jurisdictions. They cannot lend at the same rates that wealthy countries can do. And so they are dependent often on international institutions or development aid to be able to finance their major projects. And that's where the strings attached come, to say that there's only certain kinds of projects that you may invest in that we will help you finance. And again, there's a normative kind of assessment of what it is that we're willing to help Africa do to help its own people. Right, of course, and you can go back to the history of colonialism and why it's in that situation in the first place. And I will say, there are many UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's a fantastic list. Hard to be against any of the Sustainable Development Goals. But poverty is also in there. Energy access is also in there. And so it is overwhelming how much of the policy focus has been on just one of the Sustainable Development Goals, which is to achieve net zero and to minimize the impacts of climate change, and how little focus and funding has gone to, again, just getting people out of a level out of poverty and into a level of basic material well-being.
And you raised an interesting point as to why all that emphasis was there. Because I was thinking earlier when we used to visit my grandmother for lunch, and she was born in the 19th century. She had a mangle. She had one of those things for drying clothes that you had to work by hand because, again, having not had power when she was a young woman. And you think of all the importance we place on feminism and women getting into the workforce and women advancing in all kinds of different fields. And yet, freeing them from backbreaking manual labor doesn't seem to be important to people. Now, how do they miss that trade off?
Well, and it's so the data is all there. It's hard. I think there's an assumption that solar is so cheap, and it's just better off naturally, and the air will probably be better, certainly than burning wood and all those kinds of things. And I think if that was true, then you can just freely give people the choice, and they would choose that. And that's where I think there's a lack of allowing for self determination amongst developing nations about what is the best source of energy for themselves. And the answer inevitably is going to be a mix for every country based on their geography, based on their demographics, based on their industry. You will want a mix of energy sources. And so to just say it's just going to be renewables, that obviously takes away some options. And I'll say if in the data, it's almost a perfect correlation between energy use per capita and human development. And we know it's not a correlation, it's causation. The more energy you can use, the higher your well being goes up. And so, any policies that restrict the availability of energy and in all of its forms will inevitably have a deleterious effect on that human development.
Yeah, as I said at the beginning, right? It's not as though energy is a part of development. It really is it's synonymous with it, just as our own way of life. When you say the energy sector is, 18% of the economy or something, it's like you wouldn't have much of an economy without it. And we did see when we visited you in Senegal, there some solar, and it wasn't cranking out the power, was it?
No, and everybody knows the quality of the light is just not the same as with electricity that comes from sources where you have access to the base load, and no, people on the ground see it. The quality of the light is not the same, and it flickers, and it's not there. We all know it.
And one thing I did find odd when we were in Senegal, and we didn't get as far off the beaten track as I would have liked, but nevertheless, everybody had a cell phone. And it was an interesting piece of misdevelopment that evidently there was enough power to charge the cell phone,
Yes.
but there wasn't enough power to run the lathe
Yeah.
or the circular saw. And that was it felt weird.
Well, it's it feels weird, but it is not weird when you understand everything else we just talked about.
Yeah. And now, when you talk about sorry.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in on that. We're talking about the impacts on consumption for individual households and individuals, but maybe even a bigger impact is on impact on industrial activity. That is almost impossible to attract capital and to provide a good return on investment for manufacturing or other industrial activities when you're constantly faced with blackouts or brownouts or rotating shortages. And you just lose, most capital needs to be deployed almost constantly, 95, 98% of the time. And so not having that reliable electricity, having to, be at the whims of a particular storm or a particular, wind resource, which we know are seasonal, that really impacts the ability of industry to thrive and be productive in those nations.
Yeah, so if you were drawing up a development plan overall, you'd never say, and let's make sure that you'd have to be an idiot to invest there. Like, this is just never something you'd put in, except that is what we put in.
Well, I mean, you can look at China's industrial strategy, and which is to say, I mean, they've incorporated a lot of solar and a lot of wind and a lot of batteries. It can be all added. The perfect energy system has a mix of energy sources. And I guess that gets to the point of not allowing, nations in Africa in particular to develop that mix. But we know what, just a regular trajectory of power demand would look like if you're just taking into account wanting that economic development, wanting to bring your people out of poverty.
Yeah, again, you're talking about the diversity of sources because there was an episode recently in Germany where a radical group had sabotaged electric cables, and this caused major trouble in Berlin, partly because it wasn't a case of, well, okay, so the electricity's off, but the natural gas is still on because there wasn't natural gas. You get yourself in this situation where it's brittle. If one thing fails, everything fails. And again, that's bad security policy as well as bad hospital still running policy.
Well, I mean, absolutely. All these things, and now there's another iteration of this. So obviously, we enjoy high use of electricity and natural gas per capita, in Canada. Many in other nations do too, many don't. But now, as we move to a different world where technology and data centers and AI are going to be crucial to competitiveness of industries, to competitiveness of nations, to the ability to have a productive workforce, now you are going to see another layer of how not having adequate energy really handicaps a nation and an economy. And so it's not, the gap is not closing. The gap to me feels like it's widening. And we have to reverse our policies to appreciate, yes, there may be some trade-offs in emissions, but because that justify the fact that, you are going to improve GDP per capita by a great deal more.
Okay, I guess that was still kind of depressing, but we're not going to give up on finding a bright side here. So when we return, we want to talk about if you can see what should be and you can see what is, you need to locate the obstacles. What is it that's standing in the way of getting from where we are to where we wish we were? What is standing in the way in terms of engineering? What is standing in the way in terms of finance? What is standing in the way in terms of governance? But also, and as so often, ideas have consequences. What is standing in the way in the thinking about the problem? Welcome back. In the last segment, we talked about what a proper energy system for Africa would look like. And now we want to talk about what's still holding them back from getting that kind of energy system. So, Magatte, what do you think is the biggest obstacle to moving to the kind of energy system that Heather was describing?
I think we've been talking about it up till most recently. It's been the mandates that we have been getting from the nations that can finance the development of energy infrastructure in Africa. They've been getting the mandates that they cannot invest in any infrastructure project that involves fossil fuels or hydrocarbons. That's been the biggest one.
But of course, Africa's energy system was a mess 30 years ago, too. I mean, in some ways, Africa was a more depressing picture 30 years ago than it is today. So there's been some improvement, but there's something, because people are naturally creative, people naturally solve problems. Something is stopping them from being able to tackle this one.
Which one? Are you talking about the energy problem, or
why they can't build their own energy systems and thumb their noses at the green do-gooders?
I think it's, again, I sound like a broken record, but we're the poorest region in the world, and we are the poorest region in the world because we're not allowing our entrepreneurs to enterprise. So if you can't finance your own infrastructure needs and you have to rely on others to do that, you say maybe I'm not sure when you say 30 years ago it was better infrastructure-wise. Are you talking about
it was worse. It was even worse, right?
Yeah. So we have not been able to move on from that because the policies have not gotten any better in terms of whether or not do we get to have access to financing. We're not making the money ourselves to finance these projects, and the people who could finance it somehow have decided to hell with poverty, to hell with all of that. Now it's climate alarmism has become our new gospel, and because of that, we're going to go for net zero. So no, we're gonna cut the faucet in terms of financing. So that's what I see.
So Heather, when you're advising African governments, and I hope that they do frequently call you and say, please give us some advice we can actually use, what would you tell them to do so that they're not dependent upon foreigners who don't seem to understand what they need as a charitable interpretation? What are the kind of policy reforms that could let Africans build their own energy systems the way local communities need, instead of being stuck with this development model that doesn't work?
Well, I mean, I'm sure that African nations every day work hard to improve the circumstances of their own people. I will say the angle that I look at it is there a role for the rest of the world to give a hand to help them, move up the development ladder? And it'll still come back for me to financing. That is the most practical way that Western nations can assist. Also, some engineering experience, project management experience, all those things. But you have to appreciate we're in a world now where electricity demand is growing quite rapidly after about 20 years where it plateaued. So there's competition now for all kinds of electricity inputs, manufacturing, labor, all those things. And again, the developing nations will be squeezed out by competition and the willingness of people in Europe and North America and Asia to pay a higher price for all of these inputs. And so I think there is a rule that we are not on an equal footing. And the very least you could do is provide some financing at a reasonable rate. Again, if you have to finance, infrastructure which may only have a payback period over decades, and you have to pay 3 or 4 or 5% more in interest above market prices, above what we would have to do in the West, again, it's just very hard to move up that ladder. There's so many constraints coming at you for these major projects. So calling them, fossil fuel subsidies, when it's really basic infrastructure that every society to date has used, has not been helpful. And allowing, again, nations, providing financing, but allowing them to determine for their own selves what is the appropriate energy mix, what is the appropriate energy infrastructure for your particular needs.
Yeah, and I talk about this to some degree in the documentary. I'm always a bit worried about this foreign money coming in because self-government in the West evolved because the state needed the consent of the people to tax. If it didn't get that, it couldn't raise money. If it couldn't raise money, it couldn't do the stuff it wanted to do. And so I worry that even better designed international lending untethers African governments from their people. And so I think shouldn't we be kind of wary of the government consequences, even of better designed generosity?
Well, I mean, to some extent, this is true. And again, because you mentioned that things have improved in the last 30, 40 years, I think in many nations, they will have developed their economies a bit better. They will have a slightly diversified markets and they will be making incremental improvements. I guess the point here is that we kind of are actively suppressing, what 1% or 3% GDP might be good, 5 or 7% would be better and it would get more people out of poverty. So just to maximize the number of opportunities that people should be having. But I don't think there's anyone that would dispute that Africans want to have more self-determination, would like to exercise more self-determination. But at the end of the day, it's true. It's just going to be more expensive to access financing. And your hands are a little bit tied when you can't have that enabling infrastructure.
Yeah. And of course, one thing that we talked about when we were in Senegal visiting with you is that the fact that entrepreneurship is held back. And it's hard to explain to people. But again, talking about the British system and why did the Industrial Revolution happen in Britain, of all, in some sense, unlikely places. But the British government system of common law, the default was the state had to leave you alone. And there were the mechanism, again, the system of writs, habeas corpus. We take this for granted, but the government can't just lock you up. You get to get this writ from a judge saying you have to prove that you have a right to hold this person or you're going to jail. And so how do African governments and African electorates come to understand a system where freedom is the default and government restraint is the exception that must be justified?
I think many of them actually do understand that. I know it doesn't look like it, but they do. The problem you have is it's at the end of the day, it's all about incentives, right? So I think basically towards the end of colonialism, as many African nations were becoming so-called independent nations, what you had was basically we're at this time when socialism, the idea of socialism and the various forms of statism were fighting off with the ideas of free markets and freedom on one end. The African liberators who were coming out back in those days, going from colonialism to freedom, basically were siding back in those days with the side that was promoting statism. So they sided with the Marxist socialists over time because they were the only ones fighting for racial equality in times when that was not the case. And also, hey, you, the West, is who has colonized us, so we possibly cannot embrace what it is that you're practicing, which is freedom and also capitalism as your economic system. So it is when we actually went at this fork in our history, we went with the wrong actors. If you mean prosperity building. We went with the wrong actors, Marxist socialism over time, and we simply never looked back. We simply never looked back. And because of that, we are 60 some plus years later since those times of liberation, we are where we are, as poor as ever. Okay. But in the meantime, because we are poor, the rest of the world gets to say, oh, look, gee, isn't it terrible? Look at how poor they are. Let's just help them. So the rest of the world is helping us with foreign aid. And when you're doing foreign aid, all of a sudden now you've messed up with the incentives of the leader. The leader is thinking, I don't care what provides prosperity to my people. I don't want prosperity for my people, because if that prosperity comes here, I no longer receive the aid money, trillions of dollars, that I use to buy chateaux in the south of France, have 20 million mistresses, who knows what else. That is gone. And the whole aid industry, again, it's worth trillions, is like, oh, what happens to all of us? So you have created this system of incentives that benefits everybody except the poor. And so as long as that is the case, we are not getting anywhere. And you have the mainstream media, who is very anti-business, anti-capitalist, and also happen to be very climate alarmist. So you start to put all of this together, and you see how we're crumbled from underneath. And it's going to take real leadership to come out from underneath those narratives.
Yeah, and it's funny because leadership, yes, but presumably from below, not above, right?
Yes.
If all of this comes in part from thinking
Yes.
too much of the leadership needed to be from
Yes.
above.
The leadership we're talking about is going to come from underneath.
Yeah. And so this is the classic situation, right? They're from the government and they're here to help, and you better run. But if that's still the problem for whatever reason, if it's somehow gotten entrenched ideologically, if it's gotten entrenched culturally, if it's gotten entrenched in the press and in the system of law, once again, looking for the bright side, what's the alternative? How do we start to unpick this in such a way that the potential of Africans is unleashed? Welcome back. In this last segment, and perhaps incongruously in my case, we're going to put on our bell bottoms and our beads, and we're going to talk about power to the people, man, or maybe we don't say man anymore in these troubled times. But again, we keep coming back to this. How do we get power to the people, the power that's electricity and that sort of thing, by getting power to the people, control over their own lives? What are the practical steps? If a coup is staged and you become president somehow, what do you do before turning power back to the elected representatives?
Well, I won't speak to the African experience. I will speak to, the Canadian experience, and how do we make sure, for example, that Indigenous communities or remote communities have that ability to choose their own kind of electricity, their own kind of electricity sources. And it is true that we have created policies in Canada that in some cases just take that option away totally. For example, I would say the clean electricity regulations, sometimes the methane regulations, and also incentives that kind of really push communities and community leaders to choose a particular set of electricity or energy options. And so again, I think prioritizing not elite goals, but self determination and allowing people to decide. We know that what is the outcome that we want to solve for. And we know that local communities are always going to be better positioned to say what is the best way to get there themselves. But to your earlier point, absolutely, tying this to performance and to outcomes and rewarding the effective use of money. It should also be part of incentives, but not in a way that forgoes, the tools or the pathway, but in a way that incentivizes particular outcomes.
As the late, great Kenny Stabler, the Oakland Raiders quarterback, used to say before every play, easy to call, hard to run. Because how can you tie money to outcomes without imposing your preferences? That's a difficult thing to do.
Well, I think what we're trying to articulate is that we think the outcome should be reducing energy poverty. And that what we've been dealing with was that the outcome was trying to be reducing emissions. And in many ways, even a very narrow policy on that has really chosen, the perfect over the good, where you could have reduced emissions by moving from diesel to or from coal to natural gas, where you could have reduced emissions by getting people off firewood and giving them electricity. And we took those away by forcing people to move all the way to basically a net zero grid, renewables only systems, and not letting them move down a trajectory that might save money, might save emissions, but didn't achieve that perfect goal. So I think what I'm really calling for is to center energy poverty and individual material well-being as the forefront of the outcomes that we're trying to achieve.
Right. And I know one thing that's got your attention very much of late is creating enterprise zones. So instead of trying to convince people to risk a reform countrywide that doesn't feel right to them, you can just do it in one place and get a sense of the potential.
Yeah, so again, poverty is solved by prosperity. Prosperity is built by entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs need an enabling business environment as well as affordable, reliable, abundant energy sources. So because I don't believe in violence or taking, power through violence, I'll never be a coup leader. I don't think so. But what I believe in is, and that's what I'm doing, is the promotion of these special economic zones that happen. And for these special economic zones to be a next generation special economic zone that would have their own governance as well as their own law, and also have a right environment so that the zone can decide on the specific energy mix that it needs in order to thrive. And so from there on, basically, you're putting down the basic bricks foundation to build human flourishing. And so once you have provided people with economic freedom, meaning this business environment based on common law, using choice of law and choice of regulatory, which allows then for the best energy mix to be plugged on, get out of the way as the person who did this, and then let life happen. And life does happen when you allow those. And then you look 10, 15 years, 20 years later, you have a Dubai where you had a plot of sand before. And this is not rocket science. Every time it's been tried, it's worked, whether it's China and its SEZs, Dubai and its 31 SEZs, special economic zones, Hong Kong, Singapore. This is not rocket science. That's what you do. And you try it on a plot of land where you don't disrupt the rest of what's going on in the country. You prove the concept, and then from there, it's the rest of the people who themselves say, hey, why don't we apply this to the rest of the country? So for me, instead of sitting there and spending all my time screaming at the top of my lungs to people why they should be doing this and how they should be doing that, I believe in criticize by creating. If something is wrong, see if you can create an alternative and show that your alternative is a better one. And so at this scale, that's how we prove a different alternative.
And Hong Kong and Singapore are the original special economic zones at a time when much of the West as well was moving very much in a big government direction. Exactly. We had these two demonstration projects. But tragically, Heather, we have special economic zones in Canada that are the opposite. Aboriginal reserves, where property rights are not secure, where normal governance doesn't apply. We have created an experiment in restricting freedom, and it has shown how dreadful it is. Why aren't we doing something about this?
Well, I mean, you make a very good point, especially on electricity. So, as you might know, in Canada, the provinces and the territories are responsible, have jurisdiction over electricity. And it's been, for many utilities, many of them are state owned or crown utilities, have engaged in many policies to advance electricity throughout the communities within their jurisdiction. But literally, sometimes those transmission lines or those natural gas pipelines will go right up to the reserve line, maybe skim right by it to the next community. And because of the difference between federal and provincial jurisdictions and First Nation jurisdictions, that community will be left out of those lines. And so we're really creating islands of off-grid communities that cannot be connected simply because of governance issues. And I have to say, in some cases, it is the federal government now with some policies of not being able to or not willing to fund, for example, natural gas extensions because they consider that an inefficient fossil fuel subsidy to allow some communities with some provincial programs, again, to get access to that essential and affordable source of energy.
And so if an Aboriginal community wanted to build their own, say, natural gas power plant, would they have trouble getting a pipeline approved to run to their territory, even if the company was willing to do it?
Well, I have to say there are some communities that have equity ownership in some power plants and who actually, produce natural gas and sell it into the system. What we have with the situation of utilities is that you have, a ratepayer base and it's regulated by a regulator. And so you can't just add your own natural gas pipeline to the system. You can pay into it. And again, that's where the financing comes from. That often these things take decades to pay back, and the lower rate of interest, the lower price of capital you can get, I mean, that can save you, millions of dollars, years off the costs of how long you have to pay back that loan. So not having federal backing or not having provincial backing in situation again where this is infrastructure that for everyone else is considered a public right, that's very problematic, and obviously something that a lot of First Nations are bleeding their own advocacy on, wanting to have that equal access.
Yeah, because again, there's this kind of myth that Canadian Aboriginals are in the forefront of fighting against fossil fuels, that they have been against climate change for thousands of years or something along those lines. But if you actually go and talk to them, you get a very different picture than if you talk to non-Aboriginals who want to speak for Aboriginals.
I think anyone that lives in poverty, their top issue is going to be poverty. I think that's almost always the case. And so, if you're a chief in council and you have moms who can't afford formula or diapers for their babies, obviously, those are the things that you address with first, and not opposing development or not engaging in protests. And so, again, it's a refocusing of priorities of what appeals to people in cities that happen to have a lot of voters who have never experienced these issues, and what people kind of are really living with on a day-to-day basis, and just need a little bit of a helping hand to get them out of those situations.
Yeah, and again, I think you've put your finger on something that's so important in this discussion. The people who are making these decisions don't live with the consequences of them. They don't even have to see the consequences of them. How many Canadians have ever been on an Aboriginal reserve? It,
I
it's
mean,
it,
very, very,
it,
very few.
Yeah, it's a vanishingly small number, and it's part of what creates this tragedy. So, thank you both very much for being here to help talk about it and to get people to understand, again, that ideas have consequences, bad ideas have bad consequences, and we should be far more careful than we often are about what we do to other people. And again, especially what Westerners do to people in Africa they'll never see, what city dwellers in Canada do to Aboriginals they'll never see, the real human costs here. And again, I want to thank you both for being here to take part of the discussion and help bring some light to the darkness. So there's the promise, and there's the problem. It's a pretty nasty one, but as Barack Obama said, you don't really want to just sit there admiring the problem. You want to do something. So if you're with us this far, then I ask you please think about what you can do to help. And be very careful in thinking about it, not to get back into the old failed ways of doing things because you're back in the old failed ways of thinking. What we want to do here is find ways to bring real opportunity to real people to improve their own situation. For the Climate Discussion Nexus, I'm John Robson, and thanks for joining us for this discussion of our documentary, In the Dark, Senegal as a Case Study in Energy Poverty.